Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our next installment of the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society author conversation series with Lexington Books, which is a division of Rowman and Littlefield Publishers. I'm Michael Giovine. I'm the editor, the series editor for the Anthropology of Tourism, and I wanted to just give you little spiel about the series. The series we're in our, it's a pretty new series. It's a couple of years old. And actually the book that we're going to talk about was relatively one of the earlier ones in the series, and we're really grateful to have it. But it is, it's not just relegated to anthropology. It does explore tourism and heritage often from a more qualitative perspective, but it's useful for anybody who wants to delve into the cultures of tourism. And certainly the authors who have and editors who have written books for the series are not all anthropologists. They've come from a variety of disciplines: cultural studies, geography. We had a webinar with some geographers on wellness and tourism, pilgrimage. So some religious studies scholar. We're going to have a pilgrimage book that's coming out in January by an anthropologist, but also a comparative religions scholar, and so on. So if you're thinking of publishing a book in the series, or you want to check out the series, which is on our website, as long as the book embraces anthropology's holistic and comprehensive approach to studying cultures and is sensitive to this complex diversity of human expression, those are the books that we publish in this series. I'm really thrilled to have two really accomplished and very interesting authors who have co-authored a book. It's kind of rare especially for anthropologists, to co-write a book. I mean, we've co-edited books and things like that, but the nature of anthropological scholarship is such that often we either write it ourselves because we all have our own gaze, right? So it really helps to kind of bring two different gazes together, and especially from two practitioners of embodied art forms and performances, we should say, that are very sort of different, but also kind of similar in its use of body and performance. So we're talking today with the authors of Apprenticeship Pilgrimage, developing expertise through travel and training. It's a great book, and with us is Lauren Miller Griffith and Jonathan Marion. Lauren served with me on the board of the Anthropology of Tourism interest group. She's also an assistant professor of anthropology at Texas Tech University, and you are an accomplished practitioner of Capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art dance performance form, and we'd love to hear more about that. I feel like the series is very heavy on Capoeira because we also had Sergio that spoke last year on his book on Capoeira, and it is a very different kind of book. So it's great to have these two complementary of focuses, and certainly for those listening, to check out both of these books simultaneously is great. Your first book, In Search of Legitimacy: How Outsiders Become Part of the Afro-Brazilian Capoeira Tradition, really coined the term apprenticeship pilgrimage, and really is a fantastic book. As is this one. And then Jonathan Marion is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Arkansas, where you're an accomplished instructor and practitioner of ballroom dance. You do a lot of consulting, especially for NGOs, and you could, of course, talk a little bit about that. You're an affiliate faculty in gender studies, director of the VIS Vision Lab, as well as a number of, I think, listservs and other kind of mediated forums that connect practitioners of ballroom dance around the world. So I really welcome. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Before I go into asking you to unpack the title, because I think that's a big thing, how was it like, we were just talking before we started this, how was it like writing a book together? I mean, how did this come about? And why did you think that was a good idea to write together?
So I'm trying to remember when it was that I came to Arkansas. Was it 2013, maybe? Yeah, 2013, right. 14. Yeah. Right. So I joined the faculty at University of Arkansas as a visiting assistant professor. And it was kind of funny because you reached out to me, I think, and said, "Welcome to the department, Dr. Griffith." And I wrote back, hey, we know each other, but we had met years ago when I was still using my maiden name. And a few minutes later, here's Jonathan in my office. So we had this meeting before. We knew we had common interests. We had kind of fallen out of touch. And then when we were Arkansas together, it provided this opportunity to really see some commonalities between our projects. Do you want to add to our story?
Yeah, so if I'm recalling correctly, and again, it's a while back, so if I get details wrong, I think it was while you were pitching the idea for your book, your first book, that an editor from one series had said, oh, but what would be really interesting is this. And like, there was no way you had the background to do that entire project yet. But then in us talking about it, there were so many areas of theoretical overlap between my research and yours. It was like, well, wait a minute, if we put our voices together, we really already have the information and background to write that. And so then we started actually sketching that out and eventually proposing it, and it all came to be.
That's great. And you work well together? What do you think?
Yes. Yeah. Very well together. Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that it seems the book is what I like about this book, and I'll just show it again here. What I like about the book is it's extremely accessible. You know, you both brought these terms that you've utilized, in other writing, and you brought them in dialogue with each other. They are, kind of like complex, interesting technical terms that really, I think, further the scholarship on pilgrimage and on tourism and on ritual, but it's done in such an accessibly written way, and one that's really seamless. And in certain times I was trying to figure out, as I was rereading the book the other day, like who wrote what. The voice sounds very like it just switches and very easily, and I couldn't tell exactly where one person was writing and one stopped. And I think that's really a testament to really great scholarship and really great dissemination of scholarship.
Thank you. That was our goal. So, I mean, kind of our process, we talked about the entire book and how we would frame each concept and sketched it out together. And then I would take a first pass at getting, we always said, like, I cook the spaghetti and throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And
we don't really do that. Italians don't do that. I just have to say. No, but anyway.
So making my American spaghetti. And then I would sort of pass the mess over to Jonathan, and he would comb through it. And we'd kick it back and forth a couple of times after that. So I think that probably is what gave it that coherent voice throughout, and hopefully the clarity too.
Yeah, no, it was very clear. It was really well organized too. And I do want to get to that. I did want to mention for all our visitors from, I see people from around the world, even in Indonesia and elsewhere. Welcome. I'm sorry, I didn't welcome you before. And just so everybody knows, so if you look at the bottom of your panel and Zoom here, this is a webinar, so it's not like a Zoom meeting. Your voice and your audio and camera are all turned off. But there's a Q&A button down there. At any time, please write in the Q&A button, and we will either try to answer it online, or I'll ask you, do you mind coming up and during the Q&A session at the end and asking the question, and I can pop you up with the video and everything. So that's usually how these things work. So I'm sorry I didn't give those ground information beforehand. So great. So I think we need to unpack this what is the book about? And in particular, what these two terms, it seems very simple, apprenticeship pilgrimage, but they're both loaded. I don't know, they're a little loaded terms, especially the pilgrimage one. But can you unpack this term, this concept for us?
Sure. I mean, so very briefly, apprenticeship pilgrimage is a practice where you are increasing your legitimacy and developing a skill set by traveling to a major center of practice, or it may not be the major center of practice, but a recognized center of practice within a particular community. I'm just starting off because I coined the term actually in my dissertation work and then fleshed it out in some articles and of course my first book. And the reason I gravitated towards the term pilgrimage was because when I use the word tourist and tourism, my community pushed back. We're not tourists, right? So, and there was even somebody I interviewed who said, a tourist is somebody who wants to get the goods without putting in the time and effort.
That's great.
And I thought that was just such an interesting metaphor. And I think she kind of had the John and prostitute reversed in her mind, but it was still there. And I understood what she was trying to get at. Because the people I was working with really pride themselves on knowing this community and being involved in it as a practitioner, not somebody who has just surface knowledge, but somebody who really is a part of the community. And so that's the reason I went for pilgrimage. There's also, and Jonathan, I don't know if this is true in dance communities as well, but in capoeira, oftentimes people get labeled a tourist if they come to a class and then drift away, and then they come back for a while and they're not really fully committed. So it has nothing at all to do with actual tourism. It's just, a drifter that pops in and out sometimes gets pejoratively labeled a tourist. And so I wanted to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So exactly as Lauren was saying, that was the original framework. And as she was originally describing it to me, I was like, oh, I see this all the time in the competitive ballroom world, but not just at the scale of there's one major destination. There's also what then became part of the framework for our book together, this idea that there's different scales of this. And so for things which we consider maybe not, the major or main destination, it may not be you're going to be embedded for a long time, but you're not going there for other things. You're going there specifically to learn something, to get involved, to be a participant. And to say that you're a tourist there, sort of has an implication of you're going to be just an observer, as opposed to someone who's actually investing and participating and, coming back transformed.
So I guess the definition, because you kind of pick on my own definition of pilgrimage a little bit, but which is what I was kind of getting at in those publications that you cited, and thank you very much for doing that. Because I often hear from religious pilgrims, right? This is pilgrimage, not tourism. We're above and beyond, what normal tourists do, even though they use the same infrastructures, right? They're still utilizing the same infrastructures as tourism. Do you see that? Are they utilizing the same infrastructures, or is it similar infrastructures for maybe educational travel or something? I don't know.
I think for capoeiristas, in many cases, they are using similar infrastructures. They're eating at restaurants, some of them are staying in hotels or posadas, like, Brazilian bed and breakfast type places. But there's this idea that in the capoeira community, you could go anywhere in the world, and as long as there's a capoeirista living there, you could couch surf. No questions asked. Like, these people are just going to welcome you into their home. So even if they are using the same infrastructure that tourists use, I think there's a feeling that they wouldn't have to do it that way.
Yeah, that really resonates as well. It's not to say that people don't make use of those, like other infrastructures that already exist, but there's another layer of, if you're embedded enough, or if you're outgoing enough, you can say, yeah, I want to come up to this event or this training thing. Do you know anyone who can put me up for a little bit? I'm going to come down to do some research there. Do you know anyone who has a room I can stay in for a month? And again, it's not that it happens all the time, but it's something that's not going to be accessible to the average tourist to ask that for people they don't even know. Whereas here, it's if we have this activity in common, I don't need to know you. There's already this sense of joint participation and therefore legitimacy within that domain.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, sorry, Lauren.
And even the classes, I think, are different. So I'm thinking of a day when I was training in Brazil, and I was there with a lot of apprenticeship pilgrims who were training. And then in came this group of tourists. It was 2 tourists with a guide, and they were given sort of a private class in the back at the same time as the rest of us. And that, for me, really threw into sharp relief the contrast between the pilgrims and the tourists, because we were considered part of the class. And in fact, on any given day, there might be more foreigners than locals at the particular place that I trained, which is also interesting to think about. But these people were clearly marked as being different. So a teacher kind of broke off and gave them the private class. And I remember at one point that teacher had to step away, and it was actually a pilgrim who stepped in to continue teaching the tourists.
So by separating them out, they were saying, well, you're not at the level of this, or is it? I mean, I used to run educational, like high-end educational tours, and so we would do that because that was a way of actually selling the trip. Like you get a private tour with a private lesson with the masters, like you're kind of better than everybody else. But it seems like this is kind of a weird thing, because actually the people who are technically better, if you want, like in technique and everything, were the real people. But maybe is it that they weren't maybe hitting all the bases because you're going to work on one particular thing for a long time, and the tourists are getting this overview?
Well, the tourists were kind of tripping on themselves, right? Like this is a very technical art, and if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to fall and you're going to hurt yourself. So it was just a matter of they need the basics. They could not have participated with the activity that we were doing because we were like on our heads and trying to flip over, and that's probably not something that you should try on your first day. So they were kind of getting the introduction, the basic steps. It was a taste of it. Whereas, so it was a taste of it that I think gave an overall maybe seasoning of legitimacy or authenticity to their trip. It was a special event. But for us, it was just another day of hard training.
Yeah. Have you seen that as well, Jonathan, or?
Yeah, absolutely. It showed up more for me when I was most recently working on Brazilian Zouk down in Brazil. In the ballroom world, there's like the social dance studios where maybe there are people who just stop in and are taking like an intro level class with a partner or a spouse, something like that. And okay, they come and go. But once you get into the world of like competitive ballroom, like no one shows up to one of those classes unless you know what you're doing. With the Brazilian Zouk, what I saw was very much the same thing. Like, there were one-off classes or workshops that were for people who maybe are just in town or interested. But for the most part, the people who have traveled there to learn, Brazilian Zouk is not well known, even within Brazil.
And what is it? Can you explain it to us? What Zouk, and you could show us.
Sure. Basically, what more people will be familiar with is lambada, which has been around for a while. And basically, what happened at a certain point in time, close to the early 90s, lambaderos stopped being music for lambada. And so then the Brazilians in the very north could pick up the radio stations from like the French Caribbean, and there was Zouk music, and there is a Zouk dance in that area, but they could pick up the music, and rhythmically it was very similar. And so as lambaderos started dancing to the Zouk music, it became emerged and it sort of evolved in different ways. There still is lambada. Some people now say Brazilian Zouk was a poorly chosen name. Even some of the Brazilians I talked to, but it was just sort of the label that emerged. A lot of people still refer to it as lambada Zouk, just to, sort of give homage to the origins. But what's typically called Rio style now, it's slower and involves a bit more skills from other partner dance forms and contact improv, and rhythms are played with more, but lambada still absolutely exists in and of itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what is capoeira? Maybe we should have you.
Oh, great. So capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art that is a complex spectacle, including martial sparring, acrobatics, dance, music, singing. So its history is contested, and there's sort of the party line, and then we could go back and poke holes in that. And I think that's important, but not for today. So if you ask a typical practitioner, what they will say is that it was brought to Brazil during the slave trade, and enslaved Africans added music and dance to their martial training in order to disguise what it was that they were actually doing, which was fighting for eventual survival and escape. Again, there are some problematic aspects of it, but what carries forward into the future is this idea of capoeira being an art of resistance. So while it is this fun, beautiful, engaging spectacle that is really hard, and if you've ever taken a class, I mean, it is physically demanding, but it also has this idea of a capoeirista should resist oppression, at the very least, race-based discrimination, but I think it extends beyond that too. But that gets me into my new work on social justice and capoeira.
Yeah,
so I'll stop there.
No, it's true. And I mean, it's very political, right? I mean, there's lots of different factions and everything
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. I think even though this sounds like a silly question, I think it leads in to other things. How did you get involved in capoeira and ballroom dancing? How does, one start? And then at what point do you then start to do these different pilgrimages? And I should mention, the book is organized literally by, what would you want to say, like almost geographic, levels and, almost like a concentric circles. I'm picturing it, where it's like you start and once you're better than the local, you're going bigger and bigger and bigger. So how did you even get involved in that local level? And then at what point did you realize that, look, I need to further this?
Yes. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in thinking about at least the first half of the book in terms of those concentric circles. I think we drew a diagram that had concentric circles actually. And we talked about it in terms of catchment zones. And then the second half is a little bit different because it looks at some of these cases that are still apprenticeship pilgrimage, but don't fit the geographic model. So my story personally, I started researching capoeira when I was a junior in undergrad, because I had a wonderful mentor, Dr. Tom Green at Texas A&M, who gently pushed me in this direction. Basically, he said, this idea you're working on, kid, it's a non-starter, but how about you do this other thing? And I said, okay. So I just stumbled my way into it. And he sent me off to do field work in Austin, and basically said, there's a commune in Austin and they do capoeira there and they're having this workshop, go do it. And he just threw me into the deep end, and we still joke about how I wrote him the unhappy kid at camp letter when I thought I can't do this. But the thing that really struck me was everybody there, even though they're living in a commune and they had very little disposable income, they keep talking about when I go to Brazil, I'm going to go to Brazil. I'm saving up so I can go to Brazil. And it was just the repetition of that discourse. And then I went to grad school at Indiana and I started hearing the same thing in the local capoeira group there. So I think people start for whatever reason. They saw the movie Only the Strong and thought it looked cool. They saw Bob's Burgers and thought it looked cool. For whatever reason, they find themselves in a class, but there is this discourse within even the smallest local groups about Brazil being Mecca. It's where you have to go. So I think from almost day one, you're sort of told that that is the gold standard. And if you stick around long enough, you're going to go.
Yeah, Jonathan,
Yeah,
I don't see a lot of Vienna in this book. Shouldn't there be like Vienna ballroom dance? I don't know, like something.
Viennese waltz, you're thinking, I'm assuming?
Yeah, that's true, I guess as well.
To the abbreviated version is basically I was in grad school and fell for someone who was into dancing. And so they didn't live in town. And so when I got back home from my first visit, I sort of opened the yellow pages, which will date how long ago this was, and looked up dance studios and called around and, do you teach this, that, or the other? And started going in. And one of the things is I started to notice that all of these topics that I was looking at in my graduate classes at the time, about art, spectacle, ritual, gatekeepers, transmission of, non-oral knowledge, competition, cooperation, etc. Like it was this concentrated microcosm of it. And I just found it fascinating. And so I never expected to go that direction. But at one point I realized I was really not going to be able to put in a full effort if I stuck with my original project and went back to my advisor and then my committee members. I'm like, I know this is going to sound off the walls, but what if I pivot? To Steve Parrish's credit, he said, do an independent study for one semester, show me that theoretically there's something there. And if so, you're good. And so that's how it happened. And then as I started to really understand that what was getting taught, even as social dancing, was always predicated on what was the competitive version. And that was setting the standard as far as everything. And then as I started paying attention to that, it was that doesn't exist as a community in any one location. That the people who are part of the competitive circuit are traveling all the time. And so it's like, okay, if I'm going to do field work on this, I need to actually be going to different events, first throughout the US, then North America, then at the time, England and Europe were really the center, if you will. England more than anywhere else. That's shifted a bit now, but so as I started to do the field work, it was like, then that's where I need to go. But so it was never fixed in one location for me. It was one weekend I'm here, another week I'm somewhere else, because that's what the community does.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the questions that I had when reading this is, how does a site become a locus or a center of this type of apprenticeship pilgrimage? I mean, I understand, I mean, certainly Capoeira is pretty clear because there is this kind of mythology, and there's like a very long-standing historical center in Bahia, Brazil or whatever. But especially like I would have thought Vienna or something, you know, but why England? Why, you know, why California? I think you said Berkeley in the book and stuff. I mean, how do these sites all of a sudden become, you know, the Shaolin Temple of Kung Fu?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One, I want to take us back to the idea of concentric circles, because they're not distance-based. And I think that's really important for people to understand, because this was actually a conversation that, you know, Lauren and I were having. And I think one of the things that really clicked for us is we're like, wait a minute, this is about effort. Mm-hmm. And so someone, you know, might be a mile away from something, but if they have to by foot, like go over a mountain ridge to get there, you know, that could be a lot of effort versus, you know, I hop in my car and literally a minute later I'm there. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, it's concentric, but it's not distance based. It's how much time is it going to take you to get there, because it's the time, but also then what's the opportunity cost? What else could I do with my time? And so as far as how these things then emerge, I think Lauren can speak much more to the things that are like the place, right? Because that was the whole sort of predication of the model originally from her. What I saw was, you know, who are the teachers who count? And so as the prestige of a given instructor rises, or as there's a bigger cluster of instructors, then that becomes a location, a destination, because that's how you advance. That's how you gain legitimacy within a practice, is by getting better. And how do you get better? You go to the people who count as teaching you what counts as better.
Mm-hmm. And how do they get that information about who's better? Just is it through, you know, you have a chapter on mediated and online pilgrimage, you moderate a couple of listservs and things like that. Is that where they get it, or just in general, just being in these networks of, you know?
Good question.
People?
Yeah, I think that certainly the like online forums and things like that now help a little bit. But again, you know, it was because everyone's in circulation, and you see, well, who are the people winning competitions? Who are the people whose styles you really like? So, oh, do they teach? Or, oh, who are they learning from?
Right.
And you just sort of follow that trail until you find your person, or you're really usually a team of people.
Yeah. And this isn't something that they can get kind of in the university area. I mean, I was a fencer, you know, like and that's, I feel a lot of similarity because it's not something like football, right? You know, it's like everybody's doing it. And we had that kind of thing, like you have to go train at a certain area, and then you get kind of better and better. And then you go to a university that really would have one of these great coaches that were Olympians and things like that. Which I didn't do. And so I kind of stopped, which is a shame. I want to go back and travel to do this with my kids. But I mean, you know, I guess I don't even know where I was going with that, but like, it's something that you can't, there's no institutionalized, at least for ballroom dancing, there aren't these big institutionalized sites then, I guess is what you're saying. It's kind of like somebody's club, or what, I don't know what you call it, but you know, somebody's center, school.
Yeah, so In the US, there are a couple of collegiate programs that are turning out some decent people, especially as far as there's an actual program. Like lots of colleges have dance programs, very few have a concentration in ballroom. There are a few in Utah that do. But as far as then, really rising to elite levels, again, it's particular studios, right? So different dancers have studios or teach out of different studios. It's a little different in Europe where there's a club system. And like studios are for social versions, but it gets called, dance sport or sport dance. It's the competitive version. Like there are training clubs, which are very much more like the beginners train with the intermediates train with the advanced get, the direct one-on-one attention from like the in-house coaches. And like when I was in Aarhus in Denmark, the club over there is actually located in the Olympic training village there.
Yeah.
Because dance has a very different character in Europe traditionally. Has much more respect than it does in the US.
Yeah. Well, interesting. So to take this a little further, there seems to be a connection, right? Then with the effort and the skill, would there be a connection with the skill as you go from, you kind of divide the beginning of the book up, or the first couple of chapters, into like local pilgrimage, regional pilgrimage, and then main pilgrimage, So even if it's not defined necessarily in geographic concentric circles, to me, there seemed to be some sort of connection. I mean, you even say it kind of like people won't just jump to the main pilgrimage if they're not good enough, or something like that. And when they do, I would imagine that would be a problem, or how does that work?
I mean, I think it's different if you live there. So if you are local to Bahia, which is the state where most of these capoeiristas are going, of course, you're going to be a novice at some of these amazing schools, right? I think that people tend to have more patience for local novices than they would for a pilgrim who comes in. In my experience, most people aren't going to invest the time and energy in making one of these major pilgrimages unless they've been in the community for a while and sort of by default, they have developed a certain skill set. I remember very clearly trying to play the instrument. That is not my forte. I am not a musician, and I'm sitting at the bench and I am just like fumbling through this rhythm. And then they wanted me to sing and I'm cringing at the sound of my own voice. And the guy next to me is rolling his eyes. And then somebody else played and was not very good. And this guy nudges me. They're even worse than you, Lauren. Great. But what I found was it was the other pilgrims who tended to be frustrated with pilgrims that came in with low skill. And I don't know if I ever articulated why I was seeing that, but I think the presence of low-skilled pilgrims kind of casts a shadow of doubt on pilgrims in general. And so they don't want to see low-skill foreigners there because it sort of prevents their integration into the community at a very high level.
Yeah,
Jonathan,
absolutely.
did you see the same?
Yeah, I see the same thing quite a lot. It's one thing, again, if someone is like local to a studio and that's where they go, and depending on age, ability, what have you, innate talent, like they're maybe not all that good, but it's like, yeah, but you're part of us, like it's okay. Whereas if you have gone as an apprenticeship pilgrimage somewhere and you've invested some time, not just it's down the street, and then you want to get as much out of that as you can. And so when someone else shows up who's watering down that experience, that they can't go at the level, that you can't get as much out of it for yourself, it can't be as transformative, that gets really aggravating.
And that kind of goes along with the whole concept of pilgrimage, this deep, long-standing, of course, it was attributed to more religious pilgrimages, like it has to be difficult, right? If it's too easy, then it's not. I mean, I used to take pilgrims around for my dissertation, religious pilgrims around. And I remember one time I had these Irish pilgrims that flew into Rome, and I picked them up at the airport and we stopped at an auto grill for their tea, because they needed the tea, at the certain time. And the Irish get so irritated all the time with the fact that Italians don't give hot enough water for the tea, because we drink coffee, right? So like, hot enough water for the tea, and then they steam the milk, which you're supposed to have cold milk. And they're starting to complain, and they had just gotten off the plane, about an hour before, and they're complaining, and the priest comes over and he goes, "This is pilgrimage, not tourism," and somebody goes, "I know, I just didn't think it would start so soon," but there is something built in, right, with this, like, this problem of like, you have to have some sort of effort to, that makes it transformative or transcendent in a certain way. But that effort also really leads to that fundamental concept that Turner talks about, right? Of like, in the liminal stage of a ritual. And my students, a lot of them are online right now, they're studying this now, you get this sense, in the ideal sense, of communitas, right? And Turner would nuance it more than we typically use it, to say that then these pilgrimage, practitioners, or, the people running it, would make normative communitas, where they would foster things like that priest did, like, no, you're supposed to feel this way, and make rituals just to make people feel this unity, this fellow human feeling kind of a thing. But you really take that to task a little bit, Jonathan, and you suggest a really great term that we should all be using more, because I think it really is very useful, and it gets between this whole thing with, like, do they experience communitas, or like John Eade would say, they don't, and it's all about contestation. But you kind of have almost like a mid-road, like an individualized kind of sense. Can you explain this concept of concursus that you use to describe this?
Yeah, so a lot of this goes back to, and it's an interesting tie-in, as Lauren described earlier, what sort of our process was, right? I'm not great at getting things down on paper, but so we would always brainstorm together. She's really good at getting things down on paper. And so, like, she would take the first pass at things, and, then putting in the places where it's obviously examples I'm going to fill in, and we'd keep going back and forth. But I remember when I got the first draft of that chapter filled in, that I noticed how much we were talking about communitas like, and it wasn't just us, it was like, that's how it gets referred to across the literature.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting there, and I remember I was actually at my uncle's house in Phoenix at the time, and just sitting at the table and staring at it for about an hour. And I'm like, something doesn't fit here, because it's how we were referring to it. And it was like, well, but we're doing that because that's what everyone does. Well, then what is it? And I think Lauren actually is the best example of it that's in the book, and I'll be happy to let her actually relate it. But it emerged to me that what we're really talking about is that something can feel what it would feel like to an individual to have a communitas experience, but it doesn't mean it has to be that for everyone else. And so that something can be deeply personally transformative. And again, in a way that just you can't break down into anything else, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are co-participants as far as having the same takeaway from it. And so as I was then sort of going, okay, well, Turner came up with this term from the Latin, let me go start looking up some stuff. And, the term that was really, about encounter, because it's that encounter that matters for someone, even if the other person doesn't know. And so then as I was sort of, I think we got on the phone at the time, actually, and I was sort of explaining what I was thinking and why. Lauren sort of went, oh yeah, there was this person who, from the people I was interviewing about martial arts, and they related a story, which, do you want to pick that up, Lauren?
Yeah. So this Frederick, and I don't know if you guys can see this picture of him right here. He is so interesting to me because he was on this organized study abroad program that went to China. Yes, thank you. And I did pre-post interviews because I found out that this trip was happening, and there were many people that were going on this trip to China, but there was a subset, and they were focusing on martial arts, and they were hoping to go to places like, of course, Shaolin. One of the places that they went was Beijing Sports University. Now, in the pre-interview, Frederick was like, well, I'm going because it the opportunity is there. And I haven't been to China, and I probably should, but I'm not expecting like anything magical, right? I'm just going. And then afterwards, he did a complete 180, and he was using all of this language that kind of hinted at I shouldn't even say hinted, it was a spiritual experience for him. And one of the most meaningful things for him, after they had gone to this event at Beijing Sports University, which was arranged for them and was fine, but didn't really live up to expectations. He just happened to see this guy over here and thinks, oh, well, that's an older man. Maybe he knows my teacher because my teacher went here, right? So they're both older. Maybe he's got the institutional memory. So he goes over and winds up talking to this guy and finds out that that man actually was his teacher's teacher. And it was just this, wow, unexpected, unplanned, and completely transformed his sense of the trip. And then he had a similar experience. This picture is him as well, where he is meeting up with a lama. He didn't want to go to this site. He thought it's a tourist trap. It's all these Buddhas that are carved into stone. And he's looking at people taking pictures with their cameras, and he's really turned off. And then all of a sudden he has this engagement with an actual lama, and they take a picture together and they put their hands together. And that moment of human touch and connection was another transformative instance. And so those became two of the key stories that we tell in order to explain the concept of concursus.
So just for other people, so communitas is supposed to be at the main stage of the ritual, the liminal stage. People feel a sense of unity. All the practitioners together get this collective effervescence. We talked a lot about that in class. This would be maybe an individual effervescence or some sort of a more personalized. I mean, you're basically Protestantizing this concept, right? Like, between the collective and then the very individual kind of sensation a little bit.
I think it's really, sorry, Jonathan, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Lauren.
I was going to say, I think it's really appropriate to think about this or look for this in pilgrimage or tourism or any place where you've got hosts and guests coming together, because for the guest, the whole experience is sort of this heightened saliency. And everything is special. Even just like grabbing tea on the side of the road is special because it's done during your pilgrimage or your tour or whatever. Whereas the host, this is just normal life for them. So I think it becomes routine to have these encounters with people. But for the guest, it is just, a showstopper that they sort of retrospectively construct their narrative around.
Peak experience or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the other part of that that's really important is none of this is saying that there isn't communitas, right? There is. One of the things that goes on with communitas, however, is sure, I may not know that the other person's experience is the same as mine, but I do have a sense that like we're sharing and having an experience. And with concursus, I don't know if this registered for them at all, but it doesn't mean it's not deeply transformative for me. And so I think one of the examples, I don't remember now, sorry, it's been a while since we wrote the book. I don't even know if the example made it in, but I remember I was at a dance event down in Mexico and had just a 1-hour private lesson with an instructor who I'd been trying to track down forever. And I think it was a comment, I know it's a comment they didn't even realize had any impact, but to this day, it sort of like resonates for me. And I think it was 2 years later, I had another set of lessons from them in Brazil, and we ended up talking for like 30, 45 minutes afterwards. And like, I related it back and like, they remembered the lesson, but they didn't, it was a throwaway comment to them, but it was deeply transformative for me. And so I don't assume it was transformative for them. And that's what I think sets off concursus.
Yeah. So we're nearing the 45-minute mark. I have two main questions, but if anybody has questions that you want to ask, start putting them maybe in the Q&A, because we'd love to hear from some of you about about what things are on your mind. The one I forgot what the other question was. Oh, the return home. You some of the students actually asked questions about this when they were reading the book. You devote a chapter to it. I have to say that there's been some good books that have been published more recently than yours like in the last year or two that have really focused on the return home. But you're absolutely right that this is one of the earlier books that really talk about like what happens when these pilgrims return, because pilgrimage is only pilgrimage if you come back. You stay there, it's kind of weird. And Nancy Frey, of course, is the first person to really deal with that, and she ended up staying and marrying and living on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. But so what does happen? Do they become teachers? Do they get a set more you say they're not like Haji, right? The people who come back from the Hajj in Mecca and have a different title attributed to them. So what does happen?
Mm-hmm. So I think some of them do become teachers. There's a very small subset of the capoeiristas I looked at where their organizations will only award teacher titles at events held in Brazil. So they're not saying you must make a pilgrimage in order to advance, but it sort of becomes this de facto requirement. So some of them do, but I would say for most, I always said it sort of gave me a passport to more advanced sectors of the community that I may or may not have really deserved based on my actual skill level. So when I came back, my teacher was like, only the advanced students can do this, and Lauren, because she's been to Brazil. And it's like, what does that even mean, right? Like, yes, I've seen capoeira and played capoeira and trained capoeira in its homeland, but that doesn't necessarily mean I can do a backflip. But yes, I think it does give you a new status. And even if others don't recognize that, one of the things that people talk about post-pilgrimage is this new understanding of the community. Oh, I went into it thinking that there was all this tension between the Angola and the regional styles, because that's how it is here. Mm-hmm. But then I went there and capoeiristas are just capoeiristas and everybody gets along. And so they come back with that new knowledge. And I think they inhabit the social space a little bit differently than they did before. And others may or may not recognize that, but I think it does change their positionality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think with a lot of the dance forms that I'm familiar with, teaching is largely predicated just on skill level. And in the better cases, skill at teaching, not just skill at the art. But I don't think that's unique. One of the things that I think was different, excuse the cat tail right here. Let me put the cat down. Was that with some of the events I was going to where there were Brazilian instructors, especially the ones who knew that I'd spent a good amount of time over there recently, sure, it wasn't that I had necessarily the technical knowledge that they were sharing, so I wasn't at that level, but I understood the feel of how things should be. And so I was someone who they could ask for, you've been there, could you back this up? Could you attest to this? Oh, they're like, don't quite have the feeling of it. Could you go help them out? Again, not because my skill level was necessarily at a certain level, but because I had, sort of, if you will, not to open up a can of worms, but like a sense of the culture of it.
Well, certainly the status, right? And with we talk about in class, status. With status comes a different set of roles, as you move up. And I know some people actually asked, is this like a rite of passage in some way? Do you see that? I guess not everybody has to go to Brazil or to London or whatever, but is it seen as a rite of passage for the real hardcore?
Yes, without a doubt, I would say it is. Because some people will even say, I haven't been to Brazil yet. Like they'll tell you something and then there's a qualifier added onto it. There's another thing that I wanted to add in there, and it is not in the book at all because it is an interview that I did maybe last month that is still sort of percolating in my brain and I don't know what to make of it. But I think the identities that a pilgrim has is going to deeply affect the way they experience pilgrimage and who they are when they come back. And so someone was saying to me that for a lot of African-American capoeiristas in particular, when they go to Brazil, they come back with this sense of, I am a traveler, that perhaps they didn't have before. Maybe in their community, it just wasn't common or they didn't have the resources. But because of who they are in capoeira, the status they have from being a teacher, the recognition from just their skill set, the ability to go anywhere without having to pay for lodging because they can couch surf, sort of transforms their idea of who they are and what is possible for them. And I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that is that certainly for the like main pilgrimages, right? Those really usually are a rite of passage. Some of the things, again, it's part of why we constructed that first half of the book to be those effort-based, you know, sort of concentric zones. So if I'm doing something where I just have to go away for the weekend, for the most part, that's probably not. Now, how we in popular, you know, use talk about rite of passage, maybe, but in the real scholarly sense of, you know, there aren't that many in a lifetime, that isn't as a model. But again, it's going to be different for each person, because what about someone whose whole life, you know, they're so busy and they have to work all the time just to provide for themselves and their family, and you know, to actually go away for a weekend is going to be, you know, maybe twice in a lifetime. Well, yeah, then that could absolutely be a rite of passage.
Yeah. And again, we can't go into it because we're really out of time, but the whole idea of barriers, you know, you talk about in the book, and I think that that's worthwhile. But let me just ask one last question. And we had I do want to call Daniel up. He has a great question. But another thing that you anticipated before others, besides that concept of the return home, is actually dealing with about a chapter on kind of mediated or virtual sort of pilgrimage. Now, this was written before COVID, and it seems, in a way, I have to say, kind of almost poo-poo kind of the idea a little bit, because you're talking about, you know, sharing things on YouTube and listservs, and really, I got the sense that you really talked about it as, well, this is something that people do to extend the experience, which is of course extended reality and stuff like that, but doesn't take the place or supplant pilgrimage. I would like you to talk about that really quickly, but also, now that we've had COVID and the entire world is on Zoom here, and lots of shrines, lots of pilgrimage sites, people are doing virtual, especially last year, doing virtual pilgrimages, like literal synchronous kinds of things. Have you changed that idea, or have you seen a greater reliance on digital technologies at your field sites to kind of deliver this similar kinds of experiences that are still embodied, but in a different way?
Yes and no. I mean, Capoeiristas went online very quickly. And I've talked to many people who said that this was their lifeline because they weren't able to go to physical classes. Obviously, that was high risk because it's, you know, embodied and in pairs and whatnot. So that was very important to them. And they appreciated that, just like that, if somebody gave you a link, you could be in Brazil. But I still think that it's not the full experience, because concursus, for example, these are the unplanned and unexpected moments. Zoom is so highly structured. You have a link, you've got these boxes, you know what's going to happen. Some of those unexpected things can come up, but you're not going to have the same experience of, you know, walking down the street and chance meetings with people who really alter your sense of who you are in the universe. So I think that, yes, Zoom can help. And I think we need to be very careful as tourism scholars and pilgrimage scholars. Why do we travel, and what are the pros and cons? We should always think about the risks, especially now that, you know, traveling across the world, we take disease with us. We can't forget that. But I don't think that virtual pilgrimage is going to be a perfect substitution. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, very much along the same lines. And so at a certain level, you know, you can turn to online sources if it's far as just a skill, learning a skill or a skill level. Again, it's going to be easier in person, but maybe you can like sort of upscale that. But it's the difference between, say, learning a language only in a classroom versus actually living somewhere and learning the language. And it really is that same type of idea. I will say, I think it's shifted a little, at least what I've seen with Brazilian Zouk. And for the reason being, if I need to turn into a class online, well, I can just as easily turn into a class online with one of the instructors in Brazil,
Right.
Before I didn't even have access to, they didn't even offer online classes before. But now, since that's the only way they can teach, and so in that sense, it's brought some greater awareness and attention to, say, some of the more economically limited instructors there who weren't the ones who were at the scale of being invited to travel worldwide yet, and yet within the country were already very well known and respected. And so in that sense, it's had like, really nice positive effect on getting people more integrated with just sort of who's the who and what are their teachings, from really points of origin. But as far as actually what's the commitment level and what does that do as far as your self-identity and how you're recognized by others, it's not the same.
Yeah. I want to just bring up Daniel Shanahan here, because you had a great question. I think it really gets to this point of like disseminating information and learning when you're on site here. Daniel, what was the question that you had?
So can you guys hear me, first of all?
Yeah.
All right, great. So because like language is sort of a culturally informed concept, how can practitioners of an art form prevent like the essence of the art from being lost when they don't teach it in the language that was created or developed? And like, for instance, I became particularly interested in this with capoeira, because it seems like there's almost like some authenticity associated with teaching it and learning in Portuguese.
For sure. That is such a great question. I will say that the people who advance it, not in every group, but in many groups, your most advanced practitioners are learning Portuguese because they recognize it's not just learning the skills, but it's also being able to have conversations with the masters, the mestres. And so they really take their linguistic preparation seriously. Then I see other people who are, teaching the classes in the local language. For me, that's English. And when their students sing the songs of capoeira, if they don't either learn Portuguese or have really good translations, they are missing the essence. And that's especially true of these songs that have complex metaphors for resisting slavery or escaping slavery or fighting back against oppression. That's just going right over the heads of the people who don't understand the language. So yes, I think you are absolutely correct in expressing a concern about that.
Yes, so I'll offer, it's not a counterpoint because I think that absolutely is important, exactly as Lauren said, but I also see that there's variability depending on which art you're talking about, right? So I think a lot of times people will talk about dance as, a nonverbal language, but it's always used as a metaphor of it. Mm-hmm. And so I remember being at an event in a different country, and I was partnered with someone in a class who spoke the local language as a native speaker, but wasn't as experienced in that dance form as I was. And they kept saying, how come you understand the teachers before I do? Because I didn't understand a word they were saying, but I could see how they were moving or a shift in weight. And so I understood what had to come next in that dance form. And so I then actually made a point very sort of counterintuitively for what's typical in anthropology. The first time I was going down to start doing research in Brazil myself on Brazilian Zouk, I made a point of, no, I'm not going to learn the language yet, because I want to go to the dance classes at the studios with the locals and see how much I can participate or not, to just sort of have some, again, participant observation of like how much does the movement form itself count as a means of communication. And it was very funny because at one point I was leaving after 6 months, and one of the local people who was like a medium level teacher, he was fluent in English. He didn't realize I didn't speak Portuguese yet. He's like, wait, but you understand everything in all the classes. I'm like, yes, but it doesn't rely on the language.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the interesting thing with being, an embodied, you're really focusing on the embodied practice. And so there's almost like two parallel languages going on, right? You got your body language, you got your linguistic language, but then you got the it's not really paralanguage, but the habitus, that kind of the skill that you have to inculcate, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Because for the part, and again, I'm not saying this is true in all the forms. I think it's more so true in Brazilian Zouk, because there isn't enough of a sort of student base in Brazil who can afford the lessons to sustain it. And so therefore, how the teachers are doing it, like they're expecting and wanting foreigners to be coming and actually paying to keep the studios open. And so when you all come for what pre-COVID, like January was Congress month, and basically all the foreigners coming and training then is what would pay to keep the studio open for the rest of the year for locals to be able to afford it. But I think you're absolutely right that the two things are in parallel. So, okay, once I sort of established that fact, as I started to learn the language and could therefore communicate more, that absolutely opens up more understanding of the culture more broadly. That's 100% still true.
So were there any other questions? Somebody else had a question, but the microphone wasn't working. Just seeing if anybody else had any questions. I mean, we could go on forever. I mean, actually the other Daniel, I don't know if you want to come on. You had asked a question. How about I just ask it unless you want to pop on? And it was something about where is the border? I'm going to get this wrong. Daniel, is it all right if I pop you up? I don't know. You didn't write the question on, but what is the difference, or where is the limit between when people come, right? Let's say to Brazil or somewhere, because they want to get that cultural, right? That cultural knowledge as well, because that does give prestige. It does have that centering. Where is it a cultural appreciation? Where is it cultural appropriation? That was a great question too, Daniel. I'm sorry if you want to pop up or not, but that was a great question.
So did Daniel want to pop up?
I don't know. I don't see it, but okay. Yeah, why don't you answer the question? Yeah.
That is such a great question. And I do not have a definitive answer, though I will tell you, I've been playing around with an article titled Appropriate Appropriation. Because I do think, especially with capoeira, because it is rooted in this history, not just of being associated with Afro-Brazilians, but being associated with a persecuted group, enslaved Africans, right? It's very loaded. So what right do I have as a white girl in the Midwest or in Texas right now to do this art? And what I am hearing from my interlocutors is that if you approach it with an understanding of what the art was intended for, and if you use it to support people of the African diaspora, then you are using it appropriately. But if you pretend that it is an apolitical thing and you can just do it because it's pretty and it's fun, that may be appropriation. Now, people disagree with me, but that's sort of where I draw the line, is what is your intention and are you following through on that intention and actually using it to support the African diaspora, or are you just paying lip service?
Yeah, so I think one of the places where this first showed up for me was actually with the start of like popular TV shows with ballroom. So like Dancing with the Stars, the first season was right before I defended my dissertation. And they announced things like, and now samba, the dance from Brazil, or, rumba,
forbidden dance, lambada.
And it's like, and a lot of people from those different cultures, regions, backgrounds were really offended. They're like, I'm sorry, I am Latin, and that is not Latin dancing. And I think they have a real point there. It's one thing to say, here's a dance inspired by the dance from. It's one thing to say, this is the Latin American style of ballroom, because that's just the name of it. But it's where it's sort of claiming credit or that what you do is essentially, you're announcing it as the authentic version. That's where I think it becomes very problematic. And that's where I think there's absolutely an issue of appropriation. The case that I'm familiar with, where I'm trying to wrap my head around what's what, is the Brazilian Zouk Dance Council is sort of the governing body for the Brazilian Zouk sort of levels of competition. But it's predicated on the system that exists for West Coast Swing, which is an American dance form. And the idea that dance was competitive was not a Brazilian idea.
Sure.
But yet it was a Brazilian who started the council. And so I'm like, wait, I don't know what's going on here as far as appropriation or not. Obviously, I don't think the people coming from, less recognized, more marginalized, like it's not appropriation when they, borrow something, but yet that it's then being fed back as this is the only version that counts. I don't know. It's complex. It's not a one-way street.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, if there are any other questions, I mean, with that, I think it's a really great way to end this, because what I see, the pieces here is that apprenticeship, right? This idea that you are being a student. It's almost like student travel in a way, but the pilgrimage aspect really does have that transformative and also that intent aspect that, two things. I mean, we talk a lot even in religious pilgrimage as well about like traveling. You could be traveling and visiting, all the sites on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, but if you're doing it just to take pictures and you don't have the right mindset, right? I don't think those people would even call themselves pilgrims either. So I guess, what do you think the big takeaway is? I should ask you guys. I mean, what's the big takeaway from this book? Sorry.
Big takeaway. For me, it's recognizing that leisure matters, that when something becomes such an integral part of your identity, you are going to pursue it. Even if that takes you to places you never expected, you'll find a way to do it because it is that big of a part of your life.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think for me, it's, if people find the ideas, the concepts here interesting, compelling, like very gratified. But the quote I always use for sort of the purpose of education comes from Malcolm Forbes Jr., who says that the purpose of an education is to replace an empty mind with an open one. So to me, the real takeaway is if you're in reading this, you just all of a sudden say, wait a minute, maybe something else is possible. Wait a minute, maybe I can rethink this. Like, that's what I would hope that, this provokes.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to end. It's a great way also to introduce. Next week is, when we're videotaping this right now, next week is International Education Week. So even though it's pilgrimage and it's not the study abroad kind of stuff, I mean, in many ways, this is an international education. It's a form of transformative travel to educate, to inculcate certain, certain knowledge and open minds as well. So I really thank you both for coming on the webinar. It's a great book, and I think it really, like we talked about, really has a lot of implications for broader pilgrimage studies as well. This is definitely sort of secular pilgrimage, if you will, but certainly the concepts that you're talking about, the transformative nature, the open-minded, everything is very much in line with pilgrimage and tourism travel in general. So Jonathan, Lauren, thanks so much for being on the webinar. The book again is Apprenticeship Pilgrimage, and please stay tuned. We're going to have another webinar next month on this book. Shanghong Feng is going to talk about tourism and prosperity in Miaoland, and in honor of International Education Week, my own a book which was just published as well, Study Abroad in the Quest for an Anti-Tourism Experience. There is a number of podcasts and webinars that are coming out as well. So thank you so much. Thank you both for being here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Thanks greatly.